Hi, so I am Rachel Gilfarb, and it is October 26, 2017, and we are going to take it away with your intro.
Good. Well, my name is Susan Ford Wiltshire. I taught at Vanderbilt from 1971 until I retired in 2007 and had the enormous good fortune of being able to do professionally all my working life what I love to do. Now, where did that start? It started in Lubbock, Texas. Me and Buddy Holly well, have you ever heard of Buddy Holly?
Of course, I'm in an
Okay.
American popular music class.
Well, Buddy Holly used to play with my brother at our house. So, but there was not a real creative environment for girls, especially in Lubbock, and I was surrounded by a bunch of brothers. But I knew from an early age that I was a teacher. In the third grade, I was asked to fill out a little form that included the question, if you could spend a day exactly as you wanted to, what would you do? And I said I would go to school, read, and color. So I knew I would be a teacher, but I didn't know until I started studying Latin and until I went to Greece at the age of 18 what I would teach. So way led on to way, and to teach as I yearned to do. I knew I needed a PhD, so I went to New York for 4 years and did that. And when I finished, there were still lots of jobs in the humanities. That ended about 3 years later. But and there was no affirmative action, but even I had a choice of 3 nice jobs. I chose to go to the University of Illinois in Champaign. I had never taught a class, ever, when I taught my first class. After that class, it was a humanities course ended. A student came back in the door afterwards and said, "Miss Ford, have you ever taught before?" And I said, "No, but how did you know?" And he said, "I have a book that might help you. I'll bring it next class." It was a book by Sylvia Ashton Warner called Teacher. In the 50s, Ashton Warner had gone to New Zealand to teach Maori 5-year-old children. When her class began, she threw away the British standard textbooks and asked the children to tell stories they had grown up with, stories from their home. She wrote those stories down and taught them to read from their own stories. And that became my guideline for teaching forever. So you start with students where they are with what they know, and then together you bring what they know together with what you know, and everybody learns. Okay, so I'm teaching. I've had my first teacher training in Illinois, Mary Ashley Wiltshire, and moved to Nashville without a job. Resigned a tenure-track job to come to Nashville. My husband was starting law school in preparation for a legal aid career, which he did his whole working life. Well, I remember visiting the classics department at Vanderbilt, and I said, "Well, I've moved to Nashville. Do you have any ideas?" And one professor said, "Well, you could come get a PhD with us." And I said, "Well, I have one." And he said, "Well, there's a high school job down in Franklin. Maybe you could apply for that." And I said, "I'm not qualified to do that." So I trundled away. And it happened that my parents back in Texas had met the dean of the Vanderbilt Law School that summer. He was there helping start the Texas Tech Law School. And he said to them, "It's too bad Susan can never teach at Vanderbilt, but we don't hire women." So here I was without a job. And the most fortunate event ever of my professional life occurred when I got a call from the Woodrow Wilson Foundation that the position of director of the honors program at Fisk University was suddenly open, and I could apply for that. And I got that job. If I hadn't, I would have never stayed in the academy. I couldn't have, because I would have been gone for good. But it wasn't just that I had a job. It was a brilliant opportunity for me to realize how truncated and limited my own education had been. I had never read any black literature. I had not been in an environment where I was a minority, and it changed my life. And I have some difficult and some joyful memories from that time. It also brought me into this city through North Nashville, so that I got to meet people who had been involved in the sit-ins and the civil rights demonstrations. And if I had come straight to Vanderbilt, I would have missed all of that. At that time, there was a chasm about Charlotte Avenue. Mm-hmm. Okay, then in my second year, I got a phone call from the chair of the classics department. Susan, we have an unexpected opening at Vanderbilt. Someone resigned to go to another university. Would you come teach for us for a year until we can hire the man we want to hire permanently? Now, my consciousness was raised later, but it wasn't then. And I just said, well, thank you very much, but I have a good job with the possibility of tenure, and I wouldn't think of giving it up for a one-year appointment. I would be a terrible poker player. I do not know how to negotiate, and that was an honest answer. And then, a week later, he called back. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard an older man blush over the telephone, but he was blushing. I know he was, and he was sort of stuttering. And he said, well, we're ready to offer you a regular 3-year contract on tenure track. Would you like to come? And I said, well, I'll need to think about that. Again, I wasn't negotiating. What I did was go over to Vanderbilt, and I sat under this wonderful oak tree that is still there on the campus, and I leaned back, and I did what we all do. I made a list of pros and cons. And I made sure they came out exactly the same. And I thought, okay, what am I going to do? And I decided to come to Vanderbilt for 2 reasons. The main one was that I missed my academic field of classics. I have a lot of interests, and I knew that if I didn't have the infrastructure, if I didn't have the pylons of that training and that passion under me, I would just go in all directions. And in my work at Fisk, it was an interdisciplinary honors program, and that had shown me that. I also had this inkling, little did I know, that I might be able to do some good at Vanderbilt, but I had no idea what that would be. That's how I got to this interview with you.
Well, thank you so much. That's an incredible story. Wow, thank you. Okay, so let's jump into these questions. So we covered what you taught at Vanderbilt and where you grew up and, you know, your demographic background. So let's talk about a little bit your time at Vanderbilt. Mm-hmm. How would you describe the characteristics and stereotypes of the Vanderbilt students, male and female, during your time here?
Well, I was here a very long time, and I'm going to start not with stereotypes, but presumptions about Vanderbilt students to respond to your question. Sometimes people would in the community would complain to me, students can't write anymore. I bet your students at Vanderbilt can't write anymore. And I would always say calmly, then it's my job to teach them. If there were stereotypes for probably especially women students, and I suppose there were, you know, our demographic in the student body has changed profoundly since I was here. And I'm going to speak about that a little bit more as we go along. And not just economically either. But once they were in my class, there were no stereotypes. I think you have a question ahead about student participation in classes and if it differed between male and female.
Yes.
Well, almost every fall semester, I taught the same freshman seminar, first-year seminar, pretty much the same syllabus. We read the Iliad and the Odyssey. I said, I don't want any student graduating from this university without having read both, and Greek plays and philosophy. And so in those classes, there were only maybe 15 students, and I was able to do that, and that's the way I love to teach. So I wouldn't tell them right away, but I would say when some students started dominating the conversation, I would say, all right, there is a practice in this class, and you need to know about it. I call it gatekeeping. And I decide when that is instituted. And when I say, all right, it's gatekeeping time, that means that no one can speak twice until everyone has spoken once. And that gave me a structure to make sure that there was equal time. It occurs to me that maybe one reason that was so important to me is that I was diffident as a student. I had to look up what diffident meant when one of my professors in college at the University of Texas told me not to be so damn diffident. And I didn't want that to happen to the next generation, of course, especially of women. But I can tell you a funny story about a time that gender did make a difference in my class. Now, you will remember that in the Iliad, in this great war between the Greeks and the Trojans, the greatest Greek hero, Achilles, gets mad. Somebody tweeted at him the wrong way. Agamemnon insulted him, and he said, hell with you, I'm going to go. He didn't go home, but he went to his nice tent at the edge of the battlefield and just hung out. But he didn't hang out alone. He had a young man named Patroclus with him. Patroclus played beautiful music on the lyre. So we're reading along, and I see the guys in the class start snickering. We know what they were doing back in that tent. Snicker, snicker. So I say, you know, I have noticed something over the years, and that is that straight men who have the biggest problem with gay men are men who are not secure in their own sexuality. And as soon as I said that, the guys all leaned back in man spreads, I think we'll go. It was just so cute, you know. And I knew exactly what I was doing, too, but they set me up for it. Okay, so difference in participation, I can't help with much. I had so much to learn, though, when I came here, and one was on the matter of women students. There were so few women faculty, maybe 3 or 4 tenured women in the College of Arts and Science. And I think I had the notion, well, I need to be a mentor or a sponsor. I need to pay special attention to these women. And there was one young woman who I must have said something to that effect. And she said, but I didn't ask you to. And over time, I realized about mentoring that the younger ones choose. Why is that? The younger ones choose whom they want to learn more from because they know what it is they want to learn. They know what they need, and I don't. And later I came to see that Athena in the Odyssey is a mentor like that. And here's the best example. The son of Odysseus is going off to try to find out where his father is. And he's going to go visit King Nestor, who was with the Greeks in Troy. And it happens because Athena is a versatile female goddess. She can take different forms, and she had the form of the old family friend Mentor. So Mentor and Telemachus are riding along down the ocean, and Telemachus says, Mentor, how will I know what to say to him? I'm just a kid. And he's this great king. And she doesn't say, well, let's sit down and have a role playing, or let me give you some talking points. What she says to him is, your spirit and your intelligence will give you the words you need. She didn't get this way, but she stood by him. She was there. Okay, so women students. Well, now you have a question about the climate for women faculty members. Mm-hmm. What climate? It was time for climate change. The first, about 10 years I was here, we did what we could. We started a group called Professional Women at Vanderbilt. That meant that included librarians, it included staff people around the university, because we didn't have enough for a little critical mass without having a broader catchment. And that was a good start because of what I'm going to tell you later when we started organizing seriously to change the climate at Vanderbilt. So we had Professional Women at Vanderbilt, and we kept agitating in a pretty polite way. And finally, the administration did what they always do when there's an issue. They say, well, we'll make a commission on the status of women at Vanderbilt. And that led to the forming of the Women's Center at Vanderbilt in 1979, I believe it was. Is that right? 78. And that was the first institutional change. And it has been of profound benefit forever since then, to me personally, to women students, faculty. I'll tell you a story about the Commission on the Status of Women. And boy, I learned from this. Or, girl, I learned from this. My dear friend Nina Gove, who by that time I was tenured too, and so was she. Maybe now there are 5 or 6 of us. And she was appointed either chair or co-chair of the commission. So they wrote their report. And there was a female faculty member in the law school who agreed to work with Nina on how to present this to the administration. And she said, now, Nina, when the university lawyer asks you something, you don't have to answer. You can just sit there quietly. And she did. And he would get so frustrated, and finally he'd say, well, let's go on to the next recommendation. What was important? It was probably important for me because it would be my natural habit to talk back. So silence is sometimes a very good thing. So now we have the Women's Center, and then we had a really bad year for women in 1980. We lost about 5 key women. There was an associate chaplain. There was a woman in the student life office, and I don't remember now the others, who all were either fired. Well, I think they were all let go in the same year. And so we started meeting, we being women faculty and staff, and sort of thinking about how can we approach this issue. Well, the university made it pretty easy for us in that tense time because the first woman ever in the history of the English department, a marvelous scholar named Elizabeth Langland, was recommended for tenure by the English department. Wonderful. Can you imagine English? This wasn't even neuroscience. This wasn't even molecular biology. This was English. It was in the middle of the humanities, which we women are good at, so we thought. Well, we were thrilled, and then the way led on to way in the spring, and the dean didn't act when he acted on the other recommendations. And this stretched into the summer. So then in June of 1981, on a Saturday morning when the campus was empty and everyone had left, and he was getting ready to go on a 2-week vacation, the dean of the college called the chair of the English department and said, "I am not going to approve the promotion of Professor Langland. Please tell her." So Elizabeth called me that morning, and I went down the block to her house, and she told me, and I said, "Elizabeth, what are you going to do about this?" And she said, "I'm going to fight it." And I said, "Why?" It was very important to me to hear her say why. And she said, "So my daughter won't have to." I said, "Okay, I will help you. And we will do it in such a way that we will win, even if we lose." It happened that this working group of women had already planned a meeting for that Monday night, and that was the night that WEAVE was born, Women's Equity at Vanderbilt. Now, I'm going to edit her language a little bit. There was the organizing genius behind WEAVE was a woman named Catherine Snow, who was on the staff in the divinity school. And she met with Gay Welch, who was her good friend and was later the chaplain of the university. Mm-hmm. Later, I heard about this, and she said, "Gay, these faculty women may be smart, but they don't know anything about organizing. We have to teach them." And they did. So we organized, and that also set up a practice, a policy really, for WEAVE, that we would always share leadership between faculty and staff women equally. So there were always co-chairs. That was the first time at Vanderbilt that equity had ever been institutionalized. We worked very hard. We had a newsletter, we had meetings, we had, I don't know, we also had fun. And Catherine Snow said, "Look, if we don't have more fun than they do, we lose." And because they'll wonder what you're laughing about. So there were many things that helped me grow as a person and helped us grow as a movement. There may have been feminist groups in the community, but I don't know about that. You'll have to ask someone. Sissy may know about that. Well, we raised money because we pretty soon figured that there would be a lawsuit and that we would have to fund it. The day we filed the lawsuit, the university announced that there would be child care on this campus. Not related at all, of course. That was our first victory. We had been agitating advocating, I meant to say, for childcare on campus for 15 years by then. So the lawsuit was filed. Sissy Daughtry helped us decide which lawyer to engage. And then we started raising money. We had a big fundraiser at Langford Auditorium. Is that still at the medical school?
Yes.
Filled it up. The Riders in the Sky donated their performance. And at the end of it, they sang Home on the Range. And I tell you, we all stood up and joined hands and sang Home on the Range. And I never thought of Home on the Range as a movement song, but I do now, because the skies are not cloudy all day, and the deer and the antelope play. My favorite, I have two favorite stories about the fundraising. I went to a secretary, we called them then, in the divinity school, and told her what we were doing. She reached in her pocket, pulled out her wallet, and gave us everything in it and said, "I've been waiting 20 years for this." And then another active member of WEAVE and I went to visit Mary Jane Worthen at home. Mary Jane graduated from Vanderbilt in 1927 and was the first woman on the Board of Trust, and was practically the only woman on the Board of Trust. She's a hero in many of our stories, but at Vanderbilt she saw to it that the dorms became co-ed, and just a champion for justice always. So here we are now, the Board of Trust members are the defendants in this lawsuit. I say, Mary Jane, I want to look you straight in the eye when I say this. Will you help us raise $5,000 for WEAVE? And she said, I'll try. Another remarkable thing happened, and this has bearing for the history of women at Vanderbilt in ways I didn't know. Almost immediately, these senior women in the community, I'm talking about leaders of various kinds, activists, smart women, alums of Vanderbilt in the 1950s and earlier. Now, why did it matter that those women were so eager to support us? It mattered because when they were students at Vanderbilt, 4 men had to be admitted for every woman. That meant the guys did not have to take the SAT, but the women did. It also meant that those were really smart, competent women. And they started organizing, and they got their friends to host educational gatherings in the community. We had 34 of them. And Elizabeth and I would go, and we would talk about women at Vanderbilt, and they were just ready to step up, and they did. So there was a wonderful community of older and younger women working together toward the same ends. We lost the lawsuit at the district level. The day we lost the suit at the district level, the university announced that there would be appointed a tenured director of the Women's Studies program. Again, a coincidence of timing. We had been trying for years and years to get that. And my main efforts up until the time of this lawsuit were around helping start women's studies. In fact, there were so few of us, we sort of divvied things up. Well, Nina, you take care of the Commission on the Status of Women, and I'll take care for women's studies. I just love it. We also lost the case on appeal in the Sixth Circuit. Elizabeth Langland says she's prouder of that period than anything in her professional life. It was empowering, but it was engaging too. And there were good men who helped. There was a young assistant professor without tenure of sociology who organized a petition among other untenured faculty members in support of Elizabeth Langland. And someone said to him, well, aren't you worried that Vanderbilt will do something to you for doing this? And he said, well, what are they going to do to me, not give me tenure? And then the dean of the Divinity School, Walter Harrelson, was a priest and prophet for us, and the administration told him one time that he was being used by these women. And he said, I am here to be used. So I think we all grew. Now, did I ever suffer discrimination from male colleagues or administrators? Not that I know of. You'll have to ask them. Well, I look forward to your asking me another question.
Yeah, that was such an incredible narrative. I have to like recenter myself.
So do I. Oh, may I take one of your questions?
Go for it. Run with it.
What would have improved my experience at Vanderbilt?
Tell me.
Well, I was riding over here this morning with my husband looking at these questions, and I said, I don't know how to answer that. He said, well, you could say that salary equity would have been nice.
Yes.
I said, oh, yes. I hadn't thought of that. When I became chair of the department, I saw for the first time the salary scale for my colleagues. And though my rank was higher and my publications certainly were, my salary was significantly lower than some of my male colleagues. I'm not going to say I don't care about that. My husband certainly did care, but it wasn't right. And what would have improved my experience at Vanderbilt? Well, besides that, it would have been awfully nice to have a woman dean or, say, a woman provost. There just weren't any women ahead of us to show us how to do it, except if we took the broader view and nationally and locally of leaders. But we had each other. And one of the things I learned early on, never complain alone. You do that and they'll take care of you in a minute. But when you have a community, not only are you safer and more effective, but you have more agency. One time I told you that we were determined to have fun. At one point we were so tired. We had worked so hard and decided we needed to have a party. So we had a potluck dinner at my house, and my daughter, who was about 6 years old at the time, came up in the hall and said, Mommy, when does the meeting start? I said, well, Carrie, we're not having a meeting, we're having a party. And she said, you mean you have all these women here and you're not having a meeting? I wouldn't have missed it. And this whole time I got to teach. I got to do what I love to do. And I saw students grow. And I'd like to tell you one particular way I saw that. Alternative spring break was begun, I think, in the late 80s sometime.
Yes.
And the students did that.
Yes.
Students took leadership on that. They organized it. And one of the policies they adopted early on was that in both the campus organization and in individual sites, there would always be co-leaders, one male and one female. And that was the first time that gender equity in campus leadership had ever been established. You know, you might get to be the secretary of something, but this changed. And it's a more detailed story, but because of the success, the effectiveness of alternative spring break, a time came when some faculty members were asked in a college planning program, well, what can we do to improve student life at Vanderbilt? And the answer was this: well, the students gave us ASB. What are we now going to do for the students? And the Commons came out of that eventually. And that was mostly after my retirement, but even now when I walk across the campus, I see diversity of friendships and pairings that we never saw in the earlier years because of the Commons. And I'm so happy about that. So how has my attitude about Vanderbilt changed? I think the answer is that Vanderbilt has changed, as I see it, all for the good. Mm-hmm. Now, it's easier for me to say because if I were the director of the Women's Center, if I was trying to take care of women's studies or what, I'd see all the problems and I'd say, what can we do to fix them?
Well, so you were around for the opening of the Women's Center?
Mm-hmm.
How did that change campus? Mm-hmm. Like, tell me about that transition period and how you saw faculty and staff and students react to this Women's Center, male and female.
Well, it was huge, and it was a substantial move. I just remembered at the opening of it. Oh my! Well, it doesn't matter who was sort of the acting chancellor at the time. It was only 1 year that he was between chancellors. I don't even remember his name, but we were all at this reception, and I made a real faux pas. I said to him, you know, there was an ancient god of the Romans called Janus, and he was able to look backward and forward at the same time. And the term janitor comes from his name, and the janitor is one who keeps the doors open. And thank you for getting the doors open to the Women's Center. He was not pleased to be called a janitor. And I never used that analogy again. Except that is the way I think of good administrators. They keep the doors open. They keep things going and coming.
Yeah.
So the Women's Center, well, those were hard metal stairs to climb up to the second floor of that little building on West Side Road. But there was great leadership from Nancy Ransom, and it wasn't just a safe house. It was a launch pad too. I think for students, for all of us, we knew that these issues were now on the radar in a powerful way. At the beginning, at least, the director of the Women's Center reported directly to the chancellor. There was a cute thing in the commission report. Some other universities had commissions on the status of women at the same time. One of them was the University of Chicago. And I don't remember, you will know this, but I don't remember what we did about gender biased language in our report. But I do remember that the University of Chicago in theirs said, now, when we refer to he or to men, we mean also, of course, to include women, just as when you refer to Oxford, you mean also to include Cambridge. So we all have learned and continue to learn how to evolve our language as our hopes and our situations evolve. And the Women's Center helped us do that. It was a little bit tricky, I will say, when the lawsuit came, because it was very contentious. And it put the Women's Center in a position of being, in a way, part of the administration, but also advocates for women. And we had to negotiate that a little bit. But we did. And it was understandable. And it's good to have that kind of, at least we had that kind of tension instead of all being outsiders or outliers. We weren't really, but during that time we sometimes felt like. One time I just ran into a female colleague on the sidewalk outside Furman Hall, and a faculty member walked by and said, "What are you two doing? Planning a revolution?" We were trading recipes, but we didn't tell him that.
Wow.
I always enjoyed the art shows there, and I bought one or two pieces, and I would see something I liked, and then I would go back and make a site visit, sort of like they do when you want to get a foster child or adoption. You have to do a site visit to see if, and I'd go back. And if that is still not going on, I'm sorry about that, and I hope there can be other ways to have art as part of our lives, wherever we are.
I'm going a little bit off script here, but do you know if there were any programs that came out of the Women's Center to, like, I mean, obviously there was campaigning for women's equality on campus and for faculty and staff to be equally represented and equally paid. Were there any programs to involve undergraduates or graduate students?
Yes, and I'm sorry I don't know more about that, but there were. I remember students going there, but it just wasn't quite where I was to know more about it. But I would speak there and do what I could. And another thing about the Women's Center is that it was flexible. See, with women's studies, we knew what we had to do at the beginning in tiny little confines, but it was bedded in the academy, and the Women's Center had a broader portfolio.
Right. Let's see what else. Oh, how did male faculty, staff, and students respond to the opening of the Women's Center? Did they respond?
I would have to guess what a good many of the men on the faculty thought, and I prefer not to. It would not be to their credit.
Okay.
But I think what I saw was an evolution of normality for that. But it was pretty. What's the right word? evolutionary to establish a women's center. Later, we had the Black Student Center, and thank goodness, finally, the Hillel Foundation. I can't tell you how many Jewish students I wrote letters of recommendation for transferring away from Vanderbilt in the early years because it was so inhospitable. So I would like to think that the Women's Center sort of set a model for how we do that. And it's not separatist, it's support and agency for a broader community.
Yeah, it really sounds as if the Women's Center and what the original mission of the Women's Center was to support a bunch of minority students on campus originally and to set a precedence for them to create all these other offices that are here now strong.
Well, let's go back to West Side Row because I became involved early on in AIDS-related issues, and as a part of that, I was invited by K.C. Potter to come over and speak at his residence, which was an underground center for decades for GLBTQI students, and I will tell you how underground that was. Because I went to Atlanta once to speak at an alumni event, and there were two young men. I knew one of them because he had been editor of The Hustler. Very outstanding young man, Chris somebody. And he told me that maybe the alumni group or some other professional group in Atlanta had a gathering of gay men for some reason, and he said there were 4 of us who were all students at Vanderbilt at the same time, and none of us knew the others were gay.
Wow.
So I think that was the way the Women's Center helped, because I think the awareness of lesbian women was increased there. And I'm thinking now of students that I knew who felt supported there. Yeah, it all goes together.
Yeah, what was the atmosphere like when it came to being out at Vanderbilt at that time? Were people out?
Oh, I remember one student I really liked, and she really was a leader. But I remember in time there was one. Remember when we still had to sign? No, you don't remember, but I'm telling you, when you had an issue, you would make a little paper mimeograph thing, and then you would tie it around trees with strings. And there was
we
one.
Still do that.
Oh, do we still do
that?
We
have
I thought
posters.
It was all on
no,
the
we have
internet.
Posters of trees, yeah.
But there was one National Coming Out Day when we came in, and every tree had a sign of a famous person in history who was gay. And there was Michelangelo, and there was Alexander the Great, and it was just dear. There was a gay dance that the students sponsored while I was still here. And there was controversy from the community about that. I wish I could have sat down with some of the controversies. It would all be men, by the way. And I would say, I have noticed that the men who are least comfortable with gay people are men who are least secure in their own sexuality. But
right.
I'd already tried that line once. Oh, dear. Well, I rejoice in how we're all growing up around that issue. I will tell you that I had a student who did not come out until after Vanderbilt in graduate school as transgender. And that certainly brought close, because that student, and the pronoun change was easy for me. When I knew her, she was a brilliant classic student, and when I met him for the first time, he was still a brilliant classic student. So, but they didn't tell me about that in Lubbock, Texas.
And were you, how were other people's reaction to, I guess, when it came to like queer prom, for example, and the Casey Potter Center, because it seems like you're very progressive.
Oh, I try.
Yeah, compared to your colleagues of the time. Was there outward hostility?
Among faculty,
Yeah.
you're saying? Not that I know of.
Okay.
And I do know of colleagues who were very, very quietly gay at that time, and it must have been heartening to them, both men and women, but I'm thinking of men just because there were more of
Right.
them, heartening for these things to change.
So I wanted to talk to you about a few of your favorite memories at Vanderbilt. If you can give me a few of those.
Well, I think I just have. I think the establishment of the Women's Center, the establishment of child care on campus, there was an event I haven't mentioned, and it's not really in the radar, but it was very important to me. Before the lawsuit around tenure for women, the year was 1979. Apartheid was desperately defending itself in South Africa. And one of the ways that the apartheid movement protected itself was to sponsor sports teams internationally. And there's a big tennis cup called the Davis Cup. And the South African team, all white, qualified for the Davis Cup. And I don't even remember who the other team was, but universities around the country were asked to sponsor the tennis match for the Davis Cup. Princeton said no. I think Stanford said no. All the universities with which we would have liked to compare ourselves, but Vanderbilt said yes. And that was not okay. And with some leadership from faculty in the Divinity School and a few in the college, we organized the Faculty March Against Apartheid. And it was faculty from TSU, from Fisk, from Peabody, which was still separate at the time. There may have been one or two from Belmont. And we all wore our academic caps and gowns. And we met out there by the law school, and we proceeded up to the steps of Kirkland Hall and handed our petition. And they still had the tennis match, but nobody came. That was one of my happiest moments, really, when a young woman I knew pretty well in the philosophy department who was African American said to me, "If I get my PhD, I will never be as proud as I was seeing you in that march that day." So, but then the things with students are just manifest, and that was always the continuing joy for me. Our department had a reception at graduation each year for classics majors who were graduating. And I went to the one that would be the last students I ever taught graduating. And the parents of one of those young men said something about his son and our classes, and we talked a little bit, and I said, at the end of the day, it has to do with love. And I turned around and walked home, and that was the end of my official teaching career at Vanderbilt. So, Rachel, thank you for asking these questions. This might be my happiest time at Vanderbilt, to get to reflect on things that were rich and trying and a privilege.
Well, thank you. You've been an absolutely incredible source of information and history, and such a corner. Now I'm getting emotional. such a cornerstone to the way that women are represented on campus here, and it's absolutely incredible.
Well, thank you for this project, because always someone needs to tell the stories, and they keep getting written. But not if we don't tell them.
And we're going to have this forever. That's the really exciting part. How are